October 30, 1938, they said no one died.
They lied.
October 30th, 1938, Halloween Eve. 6 million Americans gathered around their radios that night, expecting entertainment. What they got instead would reshape the boundaries between fiction and reality forever. But what if the panic didn't end with fear? What if people died? In our timeline, Orson Welles' broadcast of War of the Worlds became a footnote, a curiosity about mass hysteria, a cautionary tale we tell with nervous laughter. The official record says nobody died. A few injuries, some broken windows, embarrassment all around. But history is written by those who control the narrative. And on that autumn night in 1938, the narrative was controlled by men who had every reason to minimize the truth. What if the panic was worse than they admitted? What if bodies were counted, then uncounted? What if the greatest radio hoax in history became the greatest cover-up? This is the story of what could have happened if entertainment crossed a line we can never uncross. Historical context. The world on the brink. To understand how fiction could kill, you need to understand the world that existed on October 30th, 1938. Europe was a powder keg. Hitler had annexed Austria in March. The Munich Agreement had just been signed in September, handing Czechoslovakia to Nazi Germany while promising peace for our time. American newspapers were filled with stories of refugees, concentration camps, and military buildups. War wasn't a possibility. It was inevitable. The American public was terrified, not just concerned, terrified. Every day brought fresh reports of European instability. Radio had become the primary news source, replacing newspapers as the medium of immediacy. When crisis struck, Americans didn't read about it the next morning. They heard it now, interrupting their music, their comedies, their lives. And they believed what they heard. Radio was authority. Radio was truth. Orson Welles understood this better than anyone. The 23-year-old genius had already made a name for himself with his Mercury Theater on the Air, broadcast every Sunday at 8 p.m. on CBS. His adaptations were innovative, punchy, and modern. He'd done Shakespeare, Dracula, Treasure Island. But for Halloween 1938, he wanted something special. He chose H.G. Wells's 1898 novel, The War of the Worlds. But he wouldn't just dramatize it. He would modernize it, set it in America, make it feel like it was happening right now, use the format of radio news bulletins, the same format that had been interrupting programming all year with updates about European fascism. The Federal Communications Commission had no regulations about fictional news broadcasts. There were no guidelines, no precedents, no warnings required. Entertainment and news existed in separate worlds. Until they collided. The point of divergence is subtle, almost invisible. Timing. In our reality, the broadcast began with a clear announcement. The Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the Air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. The announcement was there. It was spoken. It was clear. But what if it wasn't enough? The point of divergence is subtle, almost invisible. Timing. In our timeline, most people who panicked had tuned in late, missing the disclaimer. They'd been listening to Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy on NBC, which ran a commercial break at 8:12 p.m. Millions of listeners, bored by the ad, turned their dials. They found CBS. They found what sounded like a real news broadcast about Martian invasion. But in this timeline, the divergence happens earlier and more catastrophically. At exactly 8:09 p.m., an actual emergency interrupts programming on 3 local stations in New Jersey. A genuine crisis. A chemical plant explosion in Newark, close to the fictional Grover's Mill where Wells's Martians would land. Real smoke. Real panic, real confusion. When those local stations cut to actual emergency broadcasts about the Newark explosion, listeners across New Jersey scrambled to their radios. They twisted dials frantically, searching for information. And they found CBS already 11 minutes into Welles' broadcast, already past the disclaimer, already deep into what sounded like apocalyptic news from Grover's Mill. The fiction and reality merged. The real explosion gave credibility to the fictional invasion. Police switchboards, already overwhelmed by the Newark incident, couldn't distinguish between actual emergency calls and panic about Martians. The system broke down. And when systems break down, people die. 8 p.m., the broadcast begins. The Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the air. Most listeners hear this. Most know what's coming. But radio in 1938 is unpredictable. Static interrupts, attention wanders, children play too loudly, dinners are served. The broadcast continues with weather reports, music from the Meridian Room in the Hotel Park Plaza. Ramon Raquello and his orchestra play La Comparsita. It's boring. It's deliberately boring. This is Welles's genius. He knows people aren't paying full attention. He's lulling them. The real show doesn't start yet. At 8:09 p.m., the music stops. An announcer interrupts. Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. The voice is professional, authoritative, exactly like the real news bulletins that had been interrupting broadcasts all year. Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory in Chicago reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. It's curiosity, nothing alarming. The music resumes. But in Newark, New Jersey, real explosions are happening. Real gas, real fire, real death. 8:09 p.m. to 8:15 p.m., the Newark explosion. The Triumph Chemical Company plant in Newark's Ironbound district manufactures industrial solvents. At 8:09 p.m., a storage tank ruptures. The explosion is massive, sending a fireball 300 feet into the night sky. Windows shatter for 6 blocks. The shockwave rocks buildings. Within minutes, Newark police and fire departments are overwhelmed. Ambulances race toward the site. Local radio stations WAAT and WOR interrupt programming with legitimate emergency broadcasts. Massive explosion in Newark's industrial district. Residents advised to stay indoors. Toxic fumes possible. 3 local stations cut their regular programming. Thousands of radios across New Jersey suddenly broadcast real emergency warnings. Families panic. They turn dials frantically, searching for more information. And they find CBS. They find Orson Welles. They find what sounds like a continuation of the same emergency. At 8:12 p.m., CBS broadcasts, "Ladies and gentlemen, here's the latest bulletin from Intercontinental Radio News. Toronto, Canada. Professor Morse of McGill University reports observing a total of 3 explosions on the planet Mars." To someone who just heard about real explosions in Newark, this doesn't sound like Mars. It sounds like more explosions, different locations, escalating crisis. The music plays again, but now listeners are alert, frightened, waiting for the next interruption. 8:15 to 8:25 p.m., the cascade begins. The next interruption comes fast, too fast. By design, Welles compresses time, violates dramatic convention. In real time, only minutes pass, but in the broadcast's internal timeline, hours seem to elapse. Events accelerate impossibly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have a grave announcement to make. The strange object which fell at Grover's Mill, New Jersey earlier this evening was not a meteorite. Professor Pearson has confirmed it is a metal cylinder of extraterrestrial origin." Grover's Mill is real. It's a tiny hamlet in New Jersey, barely a crossroads, but it's real. Listeners know it. They can find it on a map. The specificity is what makes it believable. At 8:20 p.m., the Edgar Bergen Show on NBC goes to commercial. Millions of listeners, bored by the advertisement, turn their dials. They land on CBS. They hear, "I can see the thing's body now. It's large as a bear and it glistens like wet leather. The face is indescribable. The eyes are black and gleam like a serpent. The mouth is V-shaped with saliva dripping from its rimless lips." No context. No disclaimer. Just horror. And then, "Wait! Something's happening!" Machine gun fire. Screams. An announcer's voice rising in terror. "It's spreading everywhere! The smoke! Run! People are trying to escape, but they're falling like flies!" Silence. Dead air. This is where it begins. This is where fiction becomes fatal. 8:25 to 8:35 p.m., the first deaths. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, age 67, lives alone in a fifth-floor apartment in Newark. Her husband died 3 years ago. Her children live in Philadelphia. The radio is her companion. When she hears the explosions, real ones from the chemical plant, then fictional ones from CBS, she doesn't distinguish between them. To her, it's continuous, escalating, the end of everything. She doesn't have a phone. At 8:27 p.m., she opens her window and climbs onto the fire escape. Neighbors see her, they shout warnings, but they're drowned out by sirens from the real Newark emergency. She climbs higher, not lower. She's trying to reach the roof, to see better, to understand what's happening. She slips. The fire escape is old, rusted, poorly maintained. The railing gives way. 5 stories, concrete, instant. Mrs. Hoffman becomes the first casualty, but not the last. 3 blocks away, the Kowalski family, parents and 4 children aged 3 to 11, are in their car. Mr. Kowalski heard about the Newark explosion at work. He rushed home, grabbed his family, and started driving. Away. Anywhere. He doesn't know where he's going, just that he needs to flee. At 8:31 p.m., at the intersection of Market and Broad, his Chevrolet runs a red light at 40 miles per hour. He doesn't see the streetcar, or maybe he sees it and doesn't care. Nothing matters except escape. The collision kills Mr. Kowalski instantly. Mrs. Kowalski survives with critical injuries. Of the 4 children, 2 die at the scene. 1 dies in the hospital 3 hours later. The youngest, 3-year-old Anna, survives with permanent brain damage. 7 deaths in 25 minutes. And the broadcast isn't halfway finished. 8:35 to 8:45 p.m. The panic spreads. Police switchboards collapse under the volume. Newark police alone receive over 4,000 calls between 8:15 and 8:45 p.m. They can't distinguish between legitimate calls about the chemical fire and panic calls about fictional Martians. They're landing in Grover's Mill, poison gassed in Newark. My husband took the gun and left. The explosions, are they bombs? In Grover's Mill itself, population 125, residents hear their town named on the radio. They go outside, they see nothing. Empty fields, empty roads, but they hear sirens in the distance from Newark. They see other neighbors rushing to cars, fleeing. If everyone else is running, shouldn't you? The psychology of panic is contagious. It spreads faster than information. One person fleeing makes others question their own judgment. 5 people fleeing creates momentum. 50 people creates stampede. At 8:38 p.m., CBS broadcasts, "I'm speaking from the roof of Broadcasting Building, New York City. The bells you hear are ringing to warn the people to evacuate the city as the Martians approach. Estimated in the last 2 hours, 3 million people have moved out along the roads to the north." 3 million people. The specificity sells it. Numbers feel factual. In Manhattan, people look out windows. They see normal streets, normal traffic. But the radio says 3 million are fleeing. The radio says Martians approach. Who do you believe? Your eyes or authority? Some believe their eyes, some believe the radio. The ones who believe the radio start running. 8:45 to 8:55 p.m., breaking point. The George Washington Bridge becomes a choke point. Drivers fleeing Manhattan converge on it simultaneously. Normal evening traffic mixes with panic evacuation. Nobody knows why everyone is suddenly rushing north. They just know everyone is moving and they'd better move too. At 8:51 p.m., a delivery truck swerves to avoid a family running on foot across the bridge roadway. The truck hits the guardrail, overturns, and explodes. Gasoline fire spreads across 2 lanes. Drivers stop traffic completely. Drivers abandon cars and run. 4 people die in the initial explosion. 3 more are trapped in vehicles behind the burning truck. They burn to death while hundreds watch, helpless, from the stopped traffic. In New Jersey, a man named Thomas Miller arms himself with a hunting rifle and shoots at a water tower. He believes it's a Martian war machine. He fires 17 rounds before police arrive. They order him to drop the weapon. He turns toward them, rifle raised. They shoot him 8 times. He dies on the ground, still believing he was defending humanity. In a Newark hospital, Dr. Marcus Rothstein is treating victims of the chemical plant explosion when new casualties start arriving. Heart attacks, panic attacks, trampling injuries, car crashes. He doesn't understand why the volume is suddenly overwhelming. He's too busy treating patients to listen to the radio. At 8:57 p.m., a 62-year-old man named Joseph Hendricks arrives at the hospital in cardiac arrest. They try to save him. They fail. He dies at 9:04 p.m., still wearing the headphones connected to his portable radio, still listening to the broadcast that killed him. 9 p.m., the broadcast ends. At exactly 9 p.m., Orson Welles speaks in his own voice. This is Orson Welles, ladies and gentlemen, out of character to assure you that the War of the Worlds has no further significance than as the holiday offering it was intended to be, the Mercury Theater's own radio version of dressing up in a sheet and jumping out of a bush and saying boo. He's pleased with himself. He thinks it worked. He thinks people were entertained. He doesn't know yet. But the CBS switchboard knows. Thousands of calls. Screaming, crying, threats. By 9:15 p.m., police arrive at the CBS building, not to arrest anyone, not yet, but to investigate reports of mass panic. Wells is confused. He thought it was obvious the broadcast was fiction. Didn't they hear the disclaimer, he asks. Some did, the police lieutenant tells him. Some didn't. Some are dead. The room goes silent. Wells's face drains of color. He's 23 years old. He wanted to make great art. He wanted to innovate. He wanted to push boundaries. He never wanted to kill anyone. The body count. In our timeline, the official record states no one died. A few injuries, some property damage, mass hysteria, yes. Casualties? No. But official records can be managed. In this timeline, where the Newark explosion and the broadcast coincided, where panic cascaded beyond control, the deaths are real and undeniable. But they're also complicated. How do you categorize them? Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman fell from a fire escape while fleeing in panic. Official cause? Accidental fall. Does the broadcast count as a contributing factor? It's arguable. The Kowalski family died in a car crash. Official cause? Traffic accident. The father ran a red light. He was fleeing in panic, yes, but he made that choice. Is the broadcast culpable? Legally unclear. Joseph Hendricks died of a heart attack. He had pre-existing heart disease. The panic triggered the attack, but the underlying condition was already fatal. Who's responsible? Over the following weeks, investigators count 23 deaths directly or indirectly connected to the broadcast. 23 families destroyed. 23 funeral services. 23 names that should be remembered but will be deliberately forgotten. Because admitting the truth would require answering uncomfortable questions about responsibility, media regulation, and the power of mass communication. It's easier to minimize, to forget, to call it isolated incidents of mass hysteria with regrettable but unrelated coincidences. The cover-up. Within 48 hours of the broadcast, a coordinated response begins. It involves CBS, the Federal Communications Commission, local police departments, and powerful political figures who understand the implications of admitting that entertainment killed people. The strategy is subtle but effective. Isolate each incident. Mrs. Hoffman's death is recorded as accidental fall from defective fire escape. Building code violations are noted. The landlord is blamed. The Kowalski family crash is documented as reckless driving. The father's history, 2 prior speeding tickets, is emphasized. Personal responsibility is the narrative. Thomas Miller, shot by police, mentally unstable. History of paranoid behavior. The broadcast was irrelevant. He would have snapped eventually. Joseph Hendricks, heart attack from pre-existing coronary disease. Natural causes. Each death is isolated, categorized, explained away. None are officially attributed to the broadcast. The pattern is invisible if you don't look for it. But some people look. Dorothy Thompson, the prominent radio commentator, writes in the New York Tribune, "The terror spread by the broadcast is a symptom of the psychosis of our time. But we must ask, when entertainment becomes indistinguishable from news, who bears responsibility for the casualties of confusion?" She's censored. The column doesn't run. CBS pressures the Tribune's publishers. Too inflammatory, too accusatory, too dangerous. The Federal Communications Commission launches an investigation, but it's carefully controlled. The public hearings focus on mass hysteria and media responsibility in abstract terms. Specific deaths aren't mentioned. Specific families aren't called to testify. Orson Welles is questioned. He's contrite, shaken, genuinely horrified. But he's also defended. He's a young genius, an innovator. You can't criminalize creativity. You can't blame art for how people respond to it. The legal question becomes philosophical. Is fiction responsible for reality? Orson Welles, the weight of innovation. For the rest of his life, Orson Welles carries the weight. In our timeline, he became a legend, Citizen Kane, Touch of Evil, a revolutionary filmmaker who changed cinema forever. The War of the Worlds broadcast was a footnote, a fascinating bit of trivia about the power of radio. In this timeline, it's different. He still makes Citizen Kane. It's still brilliant. But the reviews are different. Critics mention the broadcast. They call him reckless. They question whether genius justifies irresponsibility. The film industry treats him carefully. Studios are nervous. Insurance companies add clauses. Can we afford to work with someone whose art might kill? Welles drinks more. He's always been a drinker, but now it's medicinal, necessary. He gives interviews where reporters inevitably ask about 1938. He's prepared his answer. "I was a young man. I wanted to push boundaries. I succeeded. The cost was higher than I imagined. I've spent 4 decades paying it." He never explicitly admits guilt, but he never denies it either. In 1975, on a late-night talk show, a caller asks him, "Do you think about the people who died?" The studio goes silent. The host tries to intervene, but Welles raises a hand. He looks directly at the camera. "Every day," he says. Their names, their faces reconstructed from newspaper photographs. Mrs. Hoffman, the Kowalski children, Joseph Hendricks. Every single day. He dies in 1985, 3 months after completing a documentary interview about the broadcast. His last words on camera, "I created something powerful. I didn't understand how powerful. That's not an excuse. That's just the truth." The aftermath, regulation, and fear. The War of the Worlds incident, or rather the official minimized version of it, leads to the Radio Act of 1939. The legislation is carefully worded. It doesn't explicitly mention Welles or CBS. It focuses on protecting public welfare and maintaining clear distinction between entertainment and news programming. The key provisions. All fictional broadcasts must include disclaimers every 15 minutes. Fictional content cannot use news bulletin format. Real location names cannot be used in fictional emergency scenarios. Stations are liable for foreseeable consequences of programming. The law passes with bipartisan support. Nobody wants to be seen defending the right to cause panic. Nobody wants to be blamed for the next incident. But the law has unintended consequences. It chills creative innovation. Radio drama becomes safer, more predictable. Writers self-censor. Networks hire compliance officers. Everything is reviewed, sanitized, stripped of edge. By 1942, when America enters World War II, radio has become primarily a government information tool. Entertainment is secondary. News is paramount. The medium that Wells proved could blur fiction and reality is now carefully policed to ensure they never blur again. Some historians argue this is necessary. Some argue it's cultural loss. All agree October 30th, 1938 was the last night American mass media operated without understanding its own power. The families. Forgotten voices. Margaret Kowalski survives the car crash. She loses her husband and 3 of her 4 children in a single moment. Her youngest, Anna, survives, but will never fully recover from her injuries. Margaret sues CBS. The lawsuit is settled quickly, quietly, for an undisclosed sum. Part of the settlement includes a non-disclosure agreement. She cannot publicly discuss the case. She cannot name CBS. She cannot tell her story. She takes the money. What choice does she have? Anna needs medical care, long-term care, expensive care. She moves to Pennsylvania, changes her name, tries to build a new life. But how do you build a life around the crater where your family used to be? She dies in 1967. Her obituary doesn't mention the crash. It doesn't mention the broadcast. It says she's survived by 1 daughter and 2 grandchildren. The other 3 children, Michael, Daniel, Ruth, exist only in cemetery records. Eleanor Hoffman's sister tries to file a wrongful death suit, but it's dismissed. Building code violations, the judge rules. The landlord is responsible, not a radio broadcast that Mrs. Hoffman may or may not have been listening to. The sister pushes back. She was running from Martians. She thought the world was ending. The judge is unsympathetic. A reasonable person, he states, would not believe in Martian invasion based on a radio broadcast clearly labeled as entertainment. Your unreasonable response was tragic, but not CBS's responsibility. The ruling sets precedent. Personal responsibility trumps media influence. The individual's failure to recognize fiction is their own fault. It's a comforting legal principle. It protects industries, it assigns blame to the dead who cannot defend themselves. The philosophical question: when does fiction become responsible for reality? If I tell you a story and you believe it and you act on that belief and your action causes harm, who's guilty? The storyteller who crafted the lie? Or the listener who believed it? Orson Welles created a brilliant fiction. He used sophisticated techniques to blur the line between entertainment and news. He succeeded beyond his imagination. People believed. Should he have known better? Should he have anticipated panic? Should he have restrained his art to protect his audience from themselves? The legal answer in this timeline becomes yes. Artists have responsibility. Creators have duty of care. If your creation is powerful enough to kill, you must consider that power before releasing it into the world. But artists push back. If we must always consider the worst possible interpretation, the most extreme response, the most vulnerable audience member, can we create anything meaningful? Must all art be safely toothless? The debate rages through the 1940s and beyond. It shapes film censorship codes, television regulation, eventually comic book codes, and video game ratings. Every moral panic about media influence traces back, in some way, to October 30th, 1938. The question never gets definitively answered, but the precedent is set. Be careful what you create. You might be held responsible for how people respond to it. The cultural shift. In our timeline, War of the Worlds is a cultural touchstone. It's taught in media studies courses as an example of radio's power. It's referenced in discussions about fake news and media literacy. It's fascinating. In this timeline, it's traumatic. The broadcast is not preserved. CBS destroys the recordings. Not officially. They claim technical issues, lost masters, standard archival failures. But the decision is deliberate. Erase the evidence, minimize the liability. For decades, you cannot hear the broadcast, you cannot study it. It exists only in memory and transcription, like a ghost of a ghost. This absence shapes American culture in subtle ways. Radio drama dies faster in this timeline. Television rises quicker, in part because it's visual, harder to mistake for reality when you can see it's a set, actors, fiction. But television brings its own questions. In 1954, when Edward R. Murrow broadcasts his exposé on Senator McCarthy, nervous executives demand constant reminders that it's news and factual. When Rod Serling launches The Twilight Zone in 1959, he must include explicit fiction disclaimers, breaking the fourth wall repeatedly to ensure no one is confused. The cost is immersion. The cost is magic. The cost is that dangerous space where fiction and reality dance together, where art can truly transform consciousness. Some artists accept this cost, some resent it. All must live with it. By the 1960s, the War of the Worlds incident has faded from public memory. The survivors are aging or dead. The lawsuits are sealed. The recordings are gone. Most Americans know the story only vaguely, if at all. A generation grows up never learning that radio fiction killed people. They believe the official narrative. Some panic, some hysteria, no real harm. When television grows dominant, when news and entertainment begin to blur again, when docudramas and reality TV and mockumentaries emerge, the lessons of 1938 are not remembered because they were never properly taught. In 2016, when fake news becomes a global phenomenon, when social media spreads panic as fast as radio once did, when people die because of misinformation believed as truth, nobody connects it to Orson Welles. Nobody remembers that we learned this lesson once before. Nobody remembers that we chose to forget it. The pattern repeats because we erased the pattern. Reflection. The cost of forgetting. History doesn't repeat. We just make the same mistakes under different names. On October 30th, 1938, in a timeline slightly different from ours, a brilliant young man created a work of art so powerful it killed people. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but the impact was real. The bodies were real. And then we erased them. We minimized. We dispersed the blame. We protected institutions and industries and reputations. We decided it was easier to forget than to confront the uncomfortable truth. Stories have power. Fiction can kill. The families grieved in silence, bound by settlements and shame. Orson Welles carried guilt until his death. CBS built its empire on the foundation of covered-up casualties. The government regulated without fully acknowledging what it was regulating against. And we, the audience, learned the wrong lesson. We learned that we shouldn't believe everything we hear. That's true, but insufficient. We should have learned that the storytellers, the networks, the corporations, the platforms, have power and must wield it carefully. That innovation without ethical consideration is dangerous. That "I didn't mean to" doesn't revive the dead. We should have learned that the line between fiction and reality is thinner than we think. And when technology makes it thinner still, we need wisdom, not just creativity. We didn't learn those lessons. So, we're learning them again, slower and bloodier, in the age of viral videos and deepfakes and algorithmic radicalization. Orson Welles didn't invent the problem, he just revealed it one Halloween Eve in 1938. We covered up the revelation. We pretended it didn't happen. We archived it as curiosity rather than catastrophe. History doesn't change, only the names we give to our mistakes. And we keep making them because we chose to forget. Closing thought. Next Halloween, when you hear stories of the War of the Worlds broadcast, remember, in another timeline, it wasn't harmless. In another timeline, 23 people died. In another timeline, we almost learned something. But we forgot. And forgetting, ultimately, is the deadliest fiction of all.